When he dies, there's no obituary, there's no state funeral, there's almost zero public recognition of his death. And so that's 1798, right? James Madison lived till 1836. James Madison's notes don't become public. The notes of the Constitutional Convention, which show you how Wilson is so central to our entire experiment, don't even become public till 1840. So that's almost nearly half a century after he died that even the public has any idea who this guy is or why he was so important.
And now we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
What is this thing? What's this podcast?
Welcome to the musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
I'm Johnson Page.
We just talk to interesting people about interesting stuff. Well, recently, as we celebrated America's 250th birthday, it reminded me of something that happened when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. My father hung a framed copy of the Declaration of Independence on the wall of the bedroom that I shared with my brother. And as my brother and I started to stare at it, we got really excited because we noticed a Rooney had signed the Declaration of Independence. There was his name right there, Caesar Rooney. And as it turned out, colonial penmanship had fooled us. It was Caesar Rodney, who happened to be president of the state of Delaware and a delegate to the Continental Convention. So it got me to thinking about the 56 people who signed the Declaration. And some of those stories we know, like Washington and Franklin and Hamilton.
I am not throwing away my shot.
There are a lot we don't know about, though, including James Wilson. He's a man that Jesse Wegman writes about in his new book, The Lost Founder. Jesse Wegman is a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, where he writes Major Questions, a newsletter on Supreme Court reform. He was a member of the New York Times editorial board from 2013 to 2025, writing about law and politics, electoral reform, and the future of American democracy. So welcome to the musical Innertube, Jesse.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, listen, did you have a Caesar Rodney moment to figure out, hey, James Wilson, I got to write about him?
You know what I discovered is that I am first cousins to Roger Sherman, who is a delegate from Connecticut, and who was one of James Wilson's biggest antagonists. So I only found that out late in the game. So that's the closest I come to our founding documents.
Okay. Well, what made you decide to write about a founding father that pretty much nobody knows about?
Well, I was writing this book on the Electoral College. My first book, it was called Let the People Pick the President. It was a history of the Electoral College and the arguments for its reform or abolition in that case. And this was 2018 or so, 2019, I think. And I was looking in Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention to find out where was it that the Electoral College gets adopted. And I stumble on this guy, this long-winded Scottish guy, who keeps talking about, popular government and self-rule and political equality. He's talking like someone from the 21st century. And on the topic of the electing the president, he says, well, we should just elect the president directly. Why is this even a discussion? And I was shocked because I thought, when all of our sort of common memory about our, the founding is that the framers didn't want anything to do with the people. They were writing a document to keep the people as far removed from government as possible. And here's this guy just talking, ad nauseum about how important it is that the people be directly represented in government, that they be directly involved, that they be equally represented. And that I just was struck by the modernity of his arguments. And so I said, who is this guy, James Wilson? It was exciting to me to find someone who sounded like he was speaking from another century. And I started asking around, and nobody seemed to know who he was. And, not even, I spoke to law firm partners, I spoke to journalists, I spoke to business people. And then the story that I like to tell is that I was at a buffet, like a brunch buffet in Boston. And it was just soon after I'd discovered Wilson. And I am standing in line. It's a kind of a fancy buffet with, it's a fancy place, somebody's house with a lot of high-powered legal people there. And I hear in line behind me is the voice of a Supreme Court justice, a sitting justice at the time. And I knew the voice, and I turned around and I was like, Justice, I've been reading all about James Wilson, and oh my God, he blows my mind. He was on the first Supreme Court, and he wrote the Constitution, and he inspired the Declaration, and I can't believe I didn't know about him. And the justice says to me, I know, of course, yes, I know James Wilson. And then within like 30 seconds of our talking, it was clear to me that I knew more. So I couldn't believe that I knew more than a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice about one of the most influential and prescient founders in American history. And I thought there's a book there.
One of the things that we get from your book, Jesse, which I think is so interesting, is just what you said, is that this guy had a hand in setting the arguments and the major issues that inform the way our government works. You take one look and you see judicial review, and he just about invents it in a way when it wasn't really a thing yet. No one knew whether the courts actually had the right to review the decisions of other courts and other states. And no one knew that. That was so new. And Wilson, very clear-sightedly, I think, for the time, said, "Well, yeah, that's why they're there. Hello." And then he's involved with the constitutional projection of a strong central executive, which was not popular at the time. And then we'll get to this, but he's also, by his silence generally, involved in the 3/5 rule, probably the most notorious part of our governmental documents. And that's what struck me, is that he's right there in the middle, just as much as Jay, just as much as Madison, just as much as Hamilton in Federalist. And you mentioned this, that, everyone reads Federalist and they think they're done, when here's another guy who was thinking it through by himself.
Well, yes, in fact, the Federalist Papers are what we sort of generally associate today with the most thorough and strongest advocacy for the Constitution. But in fact, at the time, the Federalist Papers were not as popular as a single speech that was made by James Wilson, which we know today as the State House Yard speech. And that speech he gave in October of 1787, so not even a month after the delegates to the Constitutional Convention had finished their work, signed the Constitution, and sent it off to be debated in the states. And Wilson gets up in this, in front of a full crowd of people and gives this barn burner of a speech in defense of the principles behind the Constitution that he has just played a central role in drafting. And it's a really electrifying speech. The crowd loves it. And then it becomes, as the recently departed Gordon Wood wrote, it becomes the basis of all Federalist thinking. So the principles that are in Wilson's speech spread out over the entire country and really help to drive the Constitution over the finish line in the ratification process. It's just yet another example of how he is at the center of all the different deals that happened that got this country off the ground.
He wrote, well before the Declaration was put to paper by Thomas Jefferson, words that wound up in the Declaration. How did that come about?
Right. So Wilson, you wouldn't have expected this from his birth. He was lowborn. He grew up in the Scottish countryside outside of Edinburgh. He was in a poor farming family, and was expected by his parents, who were farmers and devout Presbyterians, to enter the ministry. He rejects that route in his early teenage years, and he decides instead to go to St. Andrew's University, which is just down the road from his house. It also happens to be one of the centers of the Scottish Enlightenment, what we now understand as the Scottish Enlightenment, this explosion of political and philosophical development that today still largely defines the modern world, thinking on government and on the issues of consent and on economics, everything. Adam Smith and David Hume and Francis Hutcheson and Thomas Reed, all these people are throughout the 18th century are really, they're at the center of the world in a way, intellectually. And Wilson is studying with them. All the founders know who these guys are and they read their work, but Wilson is literally their student. And so he comes over to America in his early 20s. This is 1765, right? It's the year of the Stamp Act crisis.
Right.
America is at the beginning of what would become the revolution without necessarily being fully aware of it. But Wilson arrives on American shores, 1765. He's 23 years old, a Scottish immigrant, and he very quickly insinuates himself into American culture and politics. Within 3 years of arriving, he has trained to be a lawyer under John Dickinson, who was one of the great lawyers of the colonies. And then he writes this essay that you're referring to in 1768. He's 26 years old. I like to note that this is the same age that Bruce Springsteen was when he wrote Born to Run. And similarly, Wilson's essay is kind of like a statement, like a lifetime statement, a statement that kind of covers everything. It's summational, even when he's this young. And what he's arguing is something that nobody has argued to date, which is that Parliament, the British Parliament, has no authority at all over the colonies. Mm-hmm. This was something that no one was comfortable saying up until then. They were arguing that, well, they had some control. They're sovereign, obviously, so they control us they can do external taxes on us. They can't internally tax us. This was what the Stamp Act crisis was about, right? So everybody's doing this funny dance to try to figure out what exactly is the colony's relationship to Britain. And Wilson comes out with this 11,000-word essay that is heavily footnoted. It is legal citations, historical references, deeply learned piece of writing in which he makes very clear that Parliament has zero authority, none, over the colonies. It is such a kind of a bold statement for 1768 that his mentor at the time says to him, James, don't publish this. This is way too this is way too strongly worded for this moment. Put it away. You're a young man. You're going to have a good career in the law. Don't wreck yourself.
Slow down, son.
Yeah. So he puts it in a drawer, and then 6 years later, 1774, he publishes it. It gets published in a New York newspaper called the Gazetteer, and it becomes a hit instantly. It transforms the debate over the relationship of Britain and the colonies. It is, just as a side note, when it is published, it's published in 6 installments in the Gazetteer. It is attributed to Benjamin Franklin for reasons that have been lost to history. But somebody writes a letter to the editor and says, hey, this wasn't Ben Franklin. This is this guy, James Wilson. One of the people who read that essay is this young lawyer from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. 2 years later, Jefferson is drafting the Declaration of Independence. He has Wilson's essay on his desk as he's doing that. We know this because he's literally copied whole chunks of that essay into his commonplace book where he keeps the quotations that matter to him. And I'll give you those words that you mentioned. So here's what Wilson says. This is early on in this essay. It's in the first installment of the 6. And he writes, all men are, by nature, equal and free. No one has a right to any authority over another without his consent. All lawful government is founded on the consent of those who are subject to it. Such consent was given with a view to ensure and to increase the happiness of the governed, and so on. That sounds very similar to, a preamble that we all know by heart. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. The similarities are so close that I think a lot of historians in the last century have really come to the conclusion that Wilson's essay was, at least for that part of the Declaration, the primary influence on Jefferson. So right from the beginning in his youngest years, he is filled with a type of thinking that really informs and defines the American experiment.
It's interesting, and I agree that the Jefferson took on board a lot of Wilson's writing and thinking. First of all, I want to say how moving it is as a person who lives there and was born here to see, if you will, the birth of certain of our most beloved concepts, when is being written out so clearly and reasoned in public. That just seems so dramatic to me. And it's hard to make it as dramatic as, for example, Bunker Hill.
Yes.
It's the kind of drama that we can't get from films, but we do see him struggling and succeeding in making clear statements of the issues and ways to address them, and then standing up in the State House Yards speech and speaking. It seems, I don't know how long it was. It seems like it might have been a couple of hours, but then in those days, that was public entertainment, wasn't it? That people went to see long speeches, especially then when everything was getting hashed out.
Oh, yeah.
So
It was a Saturday night. It was a party. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
bring your homemade beer.
A couple of flagons of ale, I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah. And he stands up there for a couple of hours and gives this beautifully reasoned speech. I'm not saying there aren't contradictions in it. He was a person of contradictions. Still and all, people were electrified by it at the time. It gets republished in all of the newspapers. He must have been, for a guy who was so awkward in so many ways, he must have been a pretty good speaker.
So what's interesting, hold on, I'm going to see if I can find this quote for you. He wasn't the best speaker. It was really one of the, hold on, I'm going to find you this quote if you give me a minute while I'm talking to you.
Sure.
So Wilson, hold on, I know who said it, so I know where I'm going to look it up in the index here. But Wilson is, as you say, he's an awkward guy. He's socially awkward. He's aloof. Even his friends struggle to kind of get to know him. Here it is, 114, I think it's going to be. And he wears glasses that they slide down his nose. So he goes like this to keep his glasses from falling off his nose. And so he has his head in the air all the time. And when he has his head in the air, people think of him kind of, he's like a bit of a snob. And yeah, here it is. Okay, this is from, William Pierce is a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from Georgia. And he, thank God for this man, he sits there and he does little sort of personality / psychological sketches of all of the delegates.
Wow.
And they're just details that we would never have otherwise. They're just great. They're sometimes only a paragraph long, but they're beautiful, and sometimes they're funny. He's clearly got an opinion about these guys, and he doesn't hide from sharing it. So here's the one he says with Wilson. Mr. Wilson ranks among the foremost in legal and political knowledge. He is well acquainted with man and understands all the passions that influence him. Government seems to have been his peculiar study. All the political institutions of the world he knows in detail and can trace the causes and effects of every revolution from the earliest stages of the Grecian Commonwealth down to the present time. This is obviously from his training, as I said, in the universities of Scotland. No man is more clear, copious, and comprehensive than Mr. Wilson, yet he is no great orator. He draws the attention not by the charm of his eloquence, but by the force of his reasoning. So with Wilson, it's always about like the quality of the arguments, right? It's not about, he's not a politically supple person. He's not savvy. He never, he does serve in Congress, but he never gets to be president. The highest office he attains is an appointment, not an election, which is to the Supreme Court.
Right.
And it's this difficulty of personality that actually, I think, contributes to a lot of the struggles that he had in life, which we can talk about at length, because it's a big part of the reason why Lost is in the title of the book. He disappears in part because of all the ways in which his own personality issues affected his relations to other people, also affected his ability to stay alive in our national narrative.
Well, yeah, let's go into that now, because we've established that he was a good legal mind, and that he had a lot of great ideas, and that he was present for most of the turning points as the country decided to turn away from England and create a republic. Why don't we know about him? Why is he lost? What happened?
So the main answer to that question is the way the book begins. So there's no spoilers here, because you're going to get it right in the first 2 pages, which is that he is the way he died. So Wilson died in hiding in the back of a tavern in coastal North Carolina. He was a sitting Supreme Court justice. He had been thrown in jail twice in the 2 years prior to that for debt. He was in debtor's prison. And after the second time, his son bailed him out of jail in New Jersey, and he ended up on the run down to North Carolina to the town of one of his fellow justices, James Iredell, and he hid in the back of this tavern, John Hornblow's Tavern, near the harbor in Edenton, North Carolina. He hid there for nearly a year, hiding from his creditors and the authorities. There was no GPS at the time, right? So people couldn't track him down by his phone. And he died there in that room in ragged clothes. He had no new clothes, speaking in tongues. And he contracted malaria and then died of malaria after several weeks of intense suffering with his wife largely by his side. The reason that he was being thrown in jail, the reason that he was a fugitive from justice even while sitting on the Supreme Court, is that he was an inveterate land speculator. So he was deeply enmeshed in an incredibly reckless business of buying and selling, flipping land for profit. He was so addicted to it that he ended up in just incalculable debt. And by the end, in the 1790s, the economy starts to sour and his creditors come calling and he goes bankrupt. So, Wilson is not unique in being a land speculator. That's something that many of the founders were engaged in, but it was kind of a side hustle, right? For Wilson, it became all consuming. He owned 4 million acres of land by the later years of his life. This is a guy, we talk about, there's legitimate concerns about ethical issues on the Supreme Court today. I don't think they hold a candle to Wilson, who owns 4 million acres of land and is literally writing memos to Congress while he's a sitting justice, arguing on behalf of the companies that he is associated with, the land companies he's associated with, to get better deals that are going to help him profit from his lands. So, as we say, he's a complicated and frustrating guy, but this is the main, there are several other reasons that I go through in the book, but the main reason for his disappearance is that when he dies, he has so alienated so many people, powerful people especially, who were so sick of him at this point that they're relieved that he's gone. It's just like other people their own finances were destroyed because of him. They didn't want to deal with him anymore. When he dies, there's no obituary, there's no state funeral, there's almost zero public recognition of his death. And so that's 1798, right? James Madison lives till 1836. James Madison's notes don't become public. The notes of the Constitutional Convention, which show you how Wilson is so central to our entire experiment, don't even become public till 1840. So that's almost nearly half a century after he died that even the public has any idea who this guy is or why he was so important. By that point, the stories of the founding have been largely written and baked into the narrative that we all know today.
We all have that recurring story that we have to go through where Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal, yet he owned slaves."
Yes.
Washington owned slaves, even though he was the father of our country. And it's not a slavery thing so much with Wilson as it is, he said each individual should be allowed to be free and each individual has their own vote. And yet he's there when they create the Electoral College and the 3/5 law, which said that slaves were worth 3/5 of a person, so that bolstered the populations of the southern states. How did he get turned around from his initial ideas into the stuff that got baked into the Constitution?
This is a tough question, and it was one of the things I struggled with most in sort of telling his story. On the one hand, when you're writing a biography, you kind of fall in love with your subject and you want to make them a hero of their own life. And on the other hand, of course, we're all very complicated and contradictory people, and it wouldn't be interesting if somebody weren't. Wilson's contradictions are that, yes, as you say, everything about his political philosophy, opposes slavery, right? Equality, being represented, all of the things that as popular sovereignty, the idea of self-rule, the idea of consent, slavery violates all of those. You would think Wilson would be one of the most outspoken anti-slavery delegates of all. He was not. Other delegates, including some you named, who themselves were slave owners, were more eloquent about the moral evil of the practice they were engaged in than James Wilson, who was not a slaver. One thing I write about in the book, and we don't have a lot of records of this, is he did appear to have a man named Thomas Purcell, who was either an indentured servant or a slave, domestic slave, for many years. He emancipated him in 1794, so that's 4 years before his death. But certainly he wasn't like the plantation owners. He wasn't like Madison or Jefferson or Washington with hundreds of slaves whom they kept, in many cases until their own death. Wilson could not bring himself to speak out to at the level that I think he should have. And I've been accused of presentism, of applying 21st century standards of morality to the 18th century. And my response to that is I'm not applying my standards to James Wilson. I'm applying his standards to him.
I just want to interrupt here. That in the book, you do take it up on these terms, and I think it's interesting. I really hear you too. Is that these ideas that you are applying to him, although yes, they are prevalent here in the 21st century, they were available then. It's often
Absolutely,
said, it's often said, and I think it's often said, giving people like Jefferson a free pass, that, well, that was the times, and Madison a free pass, that was the times. Well, it was the times, but there were plenty of people who were saying this doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. Eloquently.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what you're saying is you're applying what was available in the ether around him to what he did at the time.
And the quick answer about why did he do that, you asked, is that I think, like many of the people who wanted a strong national government, they realized the country was collapsing. He saw the greatest existential threat to the country as the lack of a union. And he would do anything to get that union, including compromise with slavers. So at the end, the deal, keeping the country together, keeping the North and the South together, was more important than eliminating slavery immediately. He did say, I don't like slavery. I hope, he said, sorry about that. He said, obviously, I wish we had done more to get rid of it. We didn't. We did the best we could do, but we have laid the groundwork for ending slavery eventually. So he was on the side of the anti-slavers, but he didn't. I was upset because I wanted him to be a more eloquent voice in that direction.
And it's interesting too, because he was his talk about electing the president, for example. Every person should vote for the president, everybody in America. And yet, you're right, the people who founded America weren't ready for that rabble to be part of the coalition. They wanted that rabble to send them to a high place so that they could figure out what to do. And it's interesting because even though he was for the rabble went to his house when he was in Philadelphia as a moneyed lawyer and a land speculator and a guy who apparently looked very gentrified. And they went to his house and they were ready to string him up. How did that happen?
Yeah, they nearly did. And that, if his disappearance from American history was the kind of catalyst for writing this book, that incident at his house was in many ways the thing I struggled with and tried to, the central dilemma that I tried to work through the most. Before I get into that, I'll just say, just to be clear, so it's on the record, he did propose what became the 3/5 clause in the Constitution that you mentioned earlier. It's just another example of how he was willing to break bread with slavers in order to get this document finished. I don't think he believed in slavery. He actually did give one speech where he said, this is crazy if the South gets to count, are slaves men or are they property? If the South gets to count them as property, why can't we count our property? But that was more like of a mathematical complaint, right? It wasn't a moral complaint. And then also, as you mentioned about the electing the president, I said earlier that Wilson was arguing for a popular vote. They told him, that's not going to fly. No, there's not enough support for that. He went home, he came back the next day, and he proposed what ended up becoming the Electoral College. So there are these great ironies in Wilson's life in terms of what he believes and then what he advocates for. The scene you're talking about is, as we discussed earlier, Wilson is this very awkward guy. He's very uncomfortable. He gets involved in things where his behavior actually gets him in trouble, even though he's doing the right thing, but it comes off wrong. I go through this in detail in the book. I won't do it here, but enough of those things had happened by the late 1770s. So this is between the Declaration and the Constitution, that Wilson gets attacked in his home. A mob of militiamen storm his house, like almost 200 of them. It wasn't a small crowd. And they're angry because Philadelphia is enduring great suffering at this time. The war is underway. There's huge shortages of daily necessities in Philadelphia. And they're angry and they want to go after the elite of the city because they represent, the people who they believe are keeping them down. Wilson is a great representative of that. By then, he's a very wealthy lawyer. He lives in a really nice townhouse in the middle of the city. They storm his house. He barricades himself in there, knowing that they're coming. He barricades himself with a couple dozen friends. There's gunfire. 7 people are killed. It is the most shocking riot of the Revolutionary era. It's called we call it the Fort Wilson riot today. And it really shook a lot of the founders who were like, I can't believe, they say our streets are stained with fraternal blood. Wilson is not cowed by this. Like I've said to people before, I like, this is what drove the writing of this book. Was you would think that somebody who's as committed to popular rule, to political participation by regular people, to go through a near death, he escapes barely with his life. To say, oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I gave the people a little too much credit. Maybe I don't want them as close to government as I said before. He comes back to the Constitutional Convention 8 years later, and he's the biggest advocate of all. So that to me was an amazing, not even a contradiction. It was just like a puzzle I had to figure out about a guy who nearly gets killed by a mob, and then is the biggest proponent at the convention of giving the people more power in government.
I might add that in this Herculean series of lectures that he gives, hundreds of thousands of words, dozens and dozens of lectures that people from all over the nation's country attend because they're sort of getting an American Blackstones, as you put it.
Yes.
He makes sure to make nice with the ladies, but he's pretty definite about how they don't get to play. I think, again, I keep thinking there's a little bit of that pragmatism because women's rights was already an issue among Enlightenment thinkers. They weren't always on the right side of it, but it was out there.
Yes.
It's interesting that he would be so sort of definite in public about this.
Well, let's say this. So Wilson and Women, you're referring to his law lectures. This is a series of lectures he gives later in his life. He's been appointed to the Supreme Court. He is as high a legal presence in America as there can be. By the way, his appointment to the Supreme Court was as an associate justice, not as he wanted Chief Justice. He actually wanted it so badly that he writes this pathetic letter to George Washington before he even takes office and says, George, please make me chief. I think
absolutely revolting. Absolutely revolting.
Like, you don't do that. It's such a breach of protocol, but he's such an ambitious and sort of like awkward guy that he writes. And of course, Washington writes back and says, I don't make these, I'm going to decide it purely on the merits. The reason that Washington did not make him chief, I think is pretty safe to say. We don't have this in writing, but there's a lot of back and forth in letters from other people that suggest that everyone was well aware by 1789, 90 of Wilson's financial entanglements with land. And Washington did not want that headache. He had enough to deal with in becoming the first president. So Wilson is sort of totally humiliated by this. He then gives these lectures at the University of Pennsylvania, what is now the University of Pennsylvania, that, as you say, draw all of the brightest lights of the country, the Washington Adams, the whole federal cabinet, the Pennsylvania legislature and leaders. Everyone is coming and everyone is listening because you go and listen if James Wilson is giving a speech about law, and he ends up laying out like sort of the basics of American law for generations. And as you note in one of his early speeches, he's speaking directly to women. Wilson has had a kind of vaunted idea of women from very early on. His very first writings were not political writings. He wrote a dating column basically in a newspaper in the Pennsylvania Gazette in the 1760s. This is actually the same time that he writes that essay we were talking about earlier that influenced Jefferson. And in the dating column, he says, I prefer the conversation of a woman to that of a philosopher. And the reason he says that is this is straight out of his sort of Scottish Enlightenment upbringing, is that he thinks women are more directly connected to truth and perceive reality more more clearly than a philosopher does with all his sort of, locutions. And so all through his life, he clearly values women in a sort of special way. But of course, yes, he is a man of his time in that way, clearly. And women were not considered part of the polity. Though I will say, Wilson does propose in the Constitutional Convention adding, when they were discussing how to decide who made up the constituency of Congress members, Wilson puts in a line that says all people of every age, sex, or any age, sex, and condition. Sex, he proposes the word sex, all right? So that's
Sure.
clearly suggesting that women should be counted as part of the constituency. There were state constitutions at the time that very explicitly left women out of the count for constituents of a representative. Wilson tried to put them in. And so I think it's one little detail, but it is an important indicator that Wilson that he believed in fundamental human equality.
That's where his heart was. Yeah.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that was probably another thing that got people pissed off at him to the point where they were happy he was gone at the end. And I think one last interesting thing in the book, I live in Pennsylvania. I live very close to the Poconos. He owned a lot of land. Wilson owned a lot of land in Pennsylvania and then out towards Ohio. And one piece of land he owned was up in the Poconos. And there was a little town up there called Wilsonville, which was named for him. And in 1920s, PP&L, the Pennsylvania Power and Light Company, decided they wanted to take care of a river that was in that area and use it to generate electricity. So they built a big dam. They created what is now Lake Wallenpaupack, which is a huge recreational area up there. And they put Wilsonville underwater. So
Yes.
the last little vestiges of what was left of Wilson are now underwater in a big lake up in the middle of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I thought that was particularly evocative of the way in which he has been written out of American history, that the only thing in America named for James Wilson is now underwater.
As he was in his finances when he died.
Exactly.
Sort of a fitting tribute, maybe. I don't know. Jesse, thanks very much for the
So
book.
great.
It is a fantastic read. And again, you open it with his death. And I want to say also, as somebody who lives in central Pennsylvania, years and years ago when Killer Angels came out, and Michael Shara did a really good job of bringing you into the Civil War with those novelistic type descriptions of the people involved. You were involved in their day-to-day operations, their day-to-day feelings. And you've done the same thing to James Wilson in this book, I think.
Thank you.
Really nice read. And it really gets into who the guy was as much as you can. And I recommend it to everybody.
I appreciate you saying that. I chose to open the book that way because he exists so much in his head. He's such a kind of intellectual that I wanted to kind of humanize him. I wanted you to know that he also had a body and that body, failed miserably at the end. And so that was a conscious choice, and I'm glad it worked for you. So thank you very much.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks very much
it's my
for coming
pleasure.
on. And thanks for the book.
Great conversation. Thank you. Okay.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Or log into our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
Our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.